What's up, DWA fam? This is Asia, here to remind you that if you like this episode, go ahead and hit subscribe on Apple Podcasts or leave us a rating and a review. We really appreciate it. It goes such a long way, and we love to hear what you guys are saying. Hope y'all enjoy this week's episode. Hey, y'all, and if you're new here, welcome to the family. My name is Asia.
My name is Jared, and thank you for listening to
Done with Adulting Podcast. We are really glad you're here because we're talking all things we have to do as adults that no one warned us about during the many years we were in school.
Yes, we also discuss pop culture, current events, and give our perspective on hot topic issues in our society. And even though we're best friends, we don't always agree.
Basically, we're millennials. We get it. Adulting is hard. Welcome to your safe space.
We hope you enjoy.
Yo, we are back again with another week of Done with Adulting. Mrs. Asia Watson, how are you doing?
The missus throws me off when people say that to me, but I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. How is that still a thing? Like, I know when you first get married, even for men, I feel like it's different, but is that still a thing now?
Like, I don't know, people who, yes, like it's still weird. I still have identity crisis every single day that I change my last name. Like, I don't regret it, but I definitely miss my other name. And I don't know how long it takes to get used to it, but
yeah, I feel like for me, talking to you, it's weird to say the Watson because obviously I've known you so long as Ewing.
Don't do it then.
I know, it's crazy. Yeah. I'm not going to do that. No, not at all. That's disrespectful to Terrence.
Is it?
Some people could take that as disrespect. So I'd rather not.
I do not
jump into that. Not you, but he might.
Whatever, man. I'm like, this is the 21st century. Yeah. Literally, people don't even. I could pretend to be going by Watson and not even change it on any of my documents, and no one would ever know.
That's very true. So, I guess before we get into our topic today, let's do our weekly pregnancy check.
Oh my gosh, we're actually doing weekly pregnancy checks.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important thing. It's like I say this all the time. You're a superhero. You're carrying a baby. Women are superheroes to me. So, how are you feeling? It's a big thing. You can't just make it seem like it's not.
Today, in this exact moment, I'm feeling a little exhausted because I woke up this morning with the urge to deep clean my entire house. So, I did all that before this, and after this, I'll probably take a nap.
I was about to say, hopefully you'll be able to get some rest.
But, we're hanging in there. A few more days we'll be in third trimester. So,
almost getting closer and closer day by day.
Getting closer. Yes, indeed.
Okay, so we'll check in next week.
Okay, great.
See if this is the same.
Great.
But so introducing our topic today, this is an interview that we've been trying to get on the books for
so long.
What feels like a year now. So
at least half a year.
I know, it's been crazy. So the first time we were supposed to record with this person, I showed up to H's house. We were supposed to have two interviews. I had to work late, so I got to H's late. She was in the middle of one interview. Mm-hmm. During this interview, I got a call from my.
That was this day?
Yes, that was. My wife at the time was 8 to 9 months pregnant, and she locked herself out of her car. And this was like middle of July.
Yeah, it was like
June,
90
so
degrees
it was like
outside.
One of the hottest days of the year. And she was talking about walking home over a mile. I'm like, no, you're not going to walk home. Even though I'm like 40 to an hour away, I'll just come get you from the grocery store. So we had to cancel. The second time we were supposed to record, it was just going to be me and this person, but my internet was going bonkers for some reason. It would not work. Like, we hopped on the Zoom and we couldn't even talk to each other. But today we're finally here.
Thank God we made.
I know the guest says that she works based off of the universe, so it was meant to be that we would wait till 2022. But today we're touching on a very important topic, which is prison reform, and we are speaking with Dr. Brashani Reece.
Yes.
So want to welcome her right now. What's up, Brashani? How you doing?
Hi. Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all.
Thank you for your flexibility in our wild lives and schedules.
I mean, like after the second time, I can imagine people would be like, no, I don't want to do this anymore. You've already wasted so much of my time. So, but no, we appreciate you for being flexible and being understanding. I actually know Brashani from my previous employer where we worked together. And it's actually funny. Like one of my first instances of like meeting you and remembering when we first started working together was me hearing stories of you going out to California for protest and for like fighting for legislation, things like that. And then I got to know you even more. And then I know that you were definitely in the fight for prison reform. So I was like, we definitely have to get you on and talk about prison reform, prison, 25 to life, the death penalty. Cause I know you're very passionate about those type of, or that type of, what's the word I'm looking for?
Topic, advocacy,
you're
legislation.
Exactly. You're very passionate about that. So I thought this would be a great topic and we're so excited to have you on. You just want to share a little bit about yourself and let the listeners know who you are and how you got into this?
Absolutely. And thank you. So as Jared said, my name is Brashani and I'm a public speaker to end life sentencing, to reform the prison system. I'm also a survivor of violence, and I'm an advocate and spokesperson for restorative justice and transformative justice practices, and a few other things. But those are usually my headlines that I sort of put out there. And when people say, wait, public speaker to end life sentencing, what are you talking about, right? And so my niche, my passion, the thing that I'm the most committed to is the idea that the death penalty and lifetime incarceration are blunt objects and tools that we have come to rely on in this system and are major drivers of mass incarceration. And they are things that are inhumane and I believe should be taken off the table in the way that they are currently used.
It's crazy because if you look at how much the United States spends on prison and incarceration, doesn't it like quadruple like the next country or something like that? It's like the numbers are absolutely insane.
I mean, the numbers are astronomical, no matter what numbers you're looking at. So if you look at the number of people who are incarcerated, we're the number one country who incarcerates, right? We have more than 2.3 million people who are incarcerated. Our runners up for that, you know, if this was a competition, it's Russia who comes after us. And it's,
oh God.
Yeah. It's still drastically different, right? So when you actually take the United States and you compare it to countries that are what I would say are culturally closer in their values around democracy and freedom and things like that, more Western European countries, their rates of incarceration are very, very small in comparison to ours. And Jared, as you're mentioning, the money that then flows into the system grows every year by about $20 billion. So we've now reached the point at about $86 billion for our carceral system a year.
I'm sick.
Yeah.
And also with like the states, we have private prison institutions where they actually make money for the more inmates that they have, which to me doesn't make any type of sense at all.
So that is now becoming a very common point of conversation. And yes, I want to validate that private prisons, I believe is disgusting to even think about the idea of a corporation running the institution that cages human beings. I think that is like gross in itself. And there are many people in this country that inherently are starting to understand that we should never privatize something like incarceration. But I would like to point out that private prisons are actually only 10% of the problem. So if we're going to talk about mass incarceration in economics, we really need to talk about how the prisons are run by the states and the states contract for all of the services and the industries within the prison industrial complex. This is why we call it the prison industrial complex. So for example, a study was done by an organization called Worth Rises, and it's an incredible organization. Check it out if you've never heard of it. They actually have a 12-week curriculum that is free that you can download and sort of go through each of the industries that are represented in our country, like the construction industry, the healthcare industry, the education industry, all of that. And Worth Rises did a study and found in 2019 or 2020 that when they look at 5 states, so the largest state of each of the regions of the United States, when you just take 5 states alone, there's 4,500 private corporations that are contracted with the prison system, with the states and the prison system. And this is often why you'll hear activists on my side of the arena will kind of point out that this is just a continuation of slavery, that we have taken the slavery plantation model and moved it into a justified, well, these individuals committed crimes. And by the 13th Amendment, we are allowed to enslave people if they've committed a crime. And so what's the difference between a plantation owner who had a ledger that would count the number of bodies that they owned and the amount of money that was attached to each of that as like an asset? What's the difference between that and a prison that has a 200-bed setting, for instance, like let's say, right? And they need to keep that 200-bed active because they're paying correctional officers, they have staff, they have healthcare workers coming in, they're contracted with food vendors, I could go on, right? So it's like, really, what is the difference between that? And many of us on the activism side of things would say there isn't. We've just justified ownership of another human being.
I was actually going to mention, sorry, I was going to mention the 13th Amendment. I just cut you off like twice. I was going to mention the 13th Amendment, so I'm happy you did, because actually, I remember there was like a Netflix documentary on the 13th Amendment and exactly what you just said, how it's kind of comparable to slavery. But go ahead, Asia. I cut you off twice already.
I was just going to ask, like, can you give us some background about like how you got into this topic, like how you even got here to be so passionate about the topic, and like a little bit about your journey to this point? I feel like that I am curious, so I'm sure others are.
But that previous answer was so long. You sure you want to unpackage that?
Yes, let's unpack it.
I want to hear more of you, less of us. More of you, less of us.
No, are you kidding me? I just keep, one of my downfalls is I give 5-minute answers for everything. So feel free to like interject and be like, yo, okay. So I came by this naturally, like very organically. My family is from Lynn, Massachusetts. And at the time in which my family, was being raised, it was one of the most dangerous cities in the country.
Yes. What's the rhyme? That everybody
Lynn, city of sin. You never come out the way you went in.
That's the rhyme.
Lynn is so notorious that, no joke, there has been an active movement to try to rename the city of Lynn since the 1990s. And it's never actually happened. And now Lynn is much more gentrified, as we've seen in many of the cities. But I'm telling you, they were trying to get it renamed to, get this, Ocean City.
Hilarious.
That's kind of fire. I ain't gonna hold you.
Right?
That's a city in Maryland by the ocean, so I guess it makes sense. But
is Lynn by the water? I don't know anything about Massachusetts.
Well, then we couldn't do the rhyme.
They would come up with something else.
True. So Lynn, when I say that it was one of the most dangerous cities at the time, I also want to make sure I locate that properly, right? The rhetoric of the 60s and 70s was that if you were a diverse, under-resourced community, the rhetoric around crime and the causes of crime and all of that were directly tied to the civil rights movement. And so Lynn got a reputation for being dangerous because, yes, there was violence happening, but rather than talking about the real reasons that the violence was happening, it just got this reputation that was very attached to like, it's a very diverse city with a lot of immigrants and a lot of people of color, and incredibly financially under-resourced. And that's going to be a theme you're going to hear over and over again when we talk about mass incarceration and crime in general and the perception of crime. So my family grew up in Lynn, Massachusetts. My uncle was a member of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang. My aunt also ran with the Hells Angels, and both of them were, substance use disorder is a thing that runs in my family. And both of them were really struggling with addiction in their adolescence. So my uncle experienced incarceration. He was in MCI Walpole, which is at the time, was known as one of the most notorious prisons in the country. And we're talking about a prison that their solitary confinement are graveyards in the basement of the prison. So like there are pits that at the time they were dug in the ground in the basements of the prison, and they would put you in it and just pull a metal sort of cage thing like over the pit. That was solitary confinement in like the 1970s.
Lord have mercy.
Right? So
That's miserable.
When people start to get interested in the topic of mass incarceration, part of it is because more and more people in our country are having direct experiences with what it actually means to be incarcerated. My family had this experience back in the 70s and the 80s. So we always knew prison is like, this is not a thing you do to human beings. It's really inhumane. So fast forward, my parents get married. They get their first apartment in Lynn. And this is before I'm born. They're 19 and 20 years old. And their apartment building was firebombed in the middle of the night, and they lost everything. So my parents had it. Essentially, they fled community violence. That's how I look at it. Like the community was so unstable, there was so much violence, and they fled. Well, unfortunately for me, they fled to rural Maine, which has its own versions of what nightmarish poverty looks like. So I grew up in a place, again, under-resourced, but now completely isolated. So I saw the systems operating in those places, and they were dangerous. You don't call DCF. You know what I mean? Like if a child is in danger, they're going to be taken away. Like you don't reach out to systems for help because the repercussions that come down for you and your family are way worse than whatever it is that you're dealing with. And so I grew up in a household where I was surrounded by community violence, sexual assault, child abuse, child neglect, poverty, substance use, like all of these things were present, but we didn't even have police, nor would I ever advocate for police because they don't prevent those things or treat those things. They just respond to those things. So then I came back to Boston at the first opportunity that I could, because I was like, get me the hell out of this middle of nowhere place. And I came back to my family roots in Lynn. Fast forward a few years later, I became a member of a club that I never expected to join, which is I became a member of survivors of violence. I actually survived attempted murder when I was 24 years old.
Stop.
Right? I know, right?
Are people generally shocked when you say that?
Yeah.
As somebody who's heard that personally, I think even face to face, yes, I was like me in the room, totally shocked.
As somebody who watches a lot of crime shows, I have so many questions. Please continue. Please continue. Please continue. Oh my God. I'm going to go back on mute because I can't.
So when that all happened, as you might imagine, like the average American, I had no experience with the court system. I had no experience with what was about to unfold. And oh my God, I don't wish this on anybody. So I got the lessons of the court system firsthand. And the kind of the highlights of that were that my options were incredibly limited. I was told directly by the district attorney's office that my only choices were to either testify against the person who tried to kill me, and they were seeking an attempted murder charge. So they were seeking life imprisonment for this individual. Or if I didn't cooperate and testify, they would either subpoena me to force me on the stand to testify, or they would proceed without me. And they would just make a really great case. And they assured me that he would go away for a long time, no matter what. And they knew that if they knew this, I didn't know this. They knew that this was going to end in a plea deal because 98% of what goes into the courtroom ends in a plea deal. So they used that tactic to scare me into testifying, so that then as soon as his attorney found out I was going to testify, he had to take a deal.
So sorry to stop you, but did you not want to testify?
Correct. Because I wanted to talk to him. I wanted an alternative. I didn't want him to go to prison. He was a man I loved. Like, I was in relationship with him.
That was gonna be my next question. Yeah. I didn't know how deep you wanted to get in or how much you wanted to disclose. It was like a former partner or a family member or
former partner. And the reason it's important to disclose that is because the majority of violence happens within the family or interpersonal relationship sphere, right?
Sure.
Which is one reason it's so emotionally loaded, you know? But I had the sense about me to understand that, like, I was very traumatized. Like, don't get me wrong, violence is traumatizing, right? Like, this is not me minimizing the situation. But what I had the wits about me to understand was that putting him away in a cage and telling me that it's now illegal for me to speak to him or visit him, which it is, does nothing for my healing. It does nothing for accountability. Like, you're
for the actual victim.
Yeah, like, you're telling me that you're going to put this guy away. And I remember the assistant district attorney, she looked at me, she practically laughed when I said I wanted an alternative. I was like, isn't there some way we can all sit down and, like, talk about this? And, like, I need some closure and I want to have a conversation. Like, does he understand how scared I was? Does he understand that, like, my life flashed before my eyes? Does he know that I had visions of my body in the Charles River and, like, everything that I loved, like, gone? And, you know, like, it was a traumatizing thing. Does he know what he did? And I wanted to know, was he sorry? Like, what was he sorry? You know, and these are questions that only the people who committed the violence can answer, you know?
Yeah. I have another quick question.
Yeah.
Since you were a part of that survivors group, and I assume have, like, worked with other survivors, is that, like, a common feeling amongst domestic violence survivors? Like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, that, the way you're describing it and the way you're saying you wanted to have a conversation and all that, as somebody who did not have the experience, that is surprising to me, although not, like, you know, out of this world surprising, but I'm just wondering, like, if that is a common feeling of survivors of, like, wanting to resolve with the abuser as opposed to, like, wanting
Staying
the
away.
abuser to be in prison. Yeah. Or is that, like, a Brashani thing? Or, like, is that you know what I mean?
Yeah. So let's put a pin in the survivor conversation, because I want to make sure that we give, like, that what it's due. And I'll just sort of wrap up sort of how I got here. Right. So, like, because the question you just asked is a common question. And I want to sort of expand on that a little more, again, with another 10-minute answer, because I'm really good at them. So I go through the court process. He takes a plea, you know, he gets sentenced, he goes to prison. And then I go on with my life, sort of. And it's always sort of sitting in the back of my mind, and I'm doing my therapy and I'm doing my work and whatever. And then I make this decision to go back to school to become a forensic psychologist. And at the time, I didn't put it together. But I remember thinking, well, I want to become a forensic psychologist because I want to be the person who is in court telling the story of the incarcerated people and the trauma that led them to commit the violence. Because I want empathy to be developed for the people who are in prison. In my very naive, you know, white girl mind, like, let's just be real. I was like, oh, once everybody, like, understands, like, the trauma, like, we'll fix the problem and people can come home. And I was very naive. Yeah. So as I went into graduate school, I like to say that by day, I was becoming indoctrinated into the system, becoming a forensic psychologist, which is very embedded, like, in the structure of the prison industrial complex. And by night, I had discovered restorative justice practices, which is this very thing in the survivor conversation that I want to have. And so we'll talk about that sort of more. So by night, I was in the basement of prisons, basically becoming, like, a restorative justice activist and speaking more as a survivor of violence. Like, that was my thing by night. And then by day, I was over here, right? Eventually, you have to reconcile those two things. In the world of the system itself, you can't wear two hats. So this is why they say, like, attorneys and other people who are in the criminal justice system can only advocate so far, because as soon as many attorneys, once you've started to like cross a line, you'll be accused of like not being professional anymore. Like now you have a personal opinion about this. And so your activism sort of comes to a screeching halt, if you will. Well, and I ended up, I'm not going to say by choice because it was a variety of factors, but I ended up more on this trajectory. And so, yeah, now this is what I do is speak about mass incarceration.
Mind blown. I feel like I have 50,000 questions, but we brought you here to talk about incarceration and not about survival, domestic violence survival. But
we do need to touch back on the survivorship.
Yes, thank you for sharing this story, because we've had other survivors on the podcast before, and it's always just such an enlightening topic. So we're just appreciative when people are willing to share their story. But yeah, so I feel like this idea of restorative justice, as opposed to what America does in terms of like prison and all that stuff, like our prison system is not reformative or anything like that. That's why we're here talking about this. So to go back to my other question, is that, for other survivors, in your opinion, like, is that a common feeling to want resolve, as opposed to, because the way you described it, you were like, this person went to jail and then I went on with my life, sort of. And you're like, this is still a thing that you deal with on a daily basis. And do you think it's because you didn't get that resolve? And so I guess, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, is that a common feeling for people? I know you can't speak for everybody, but just in your experience.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of research coming out these days, right? And there is a lot of advocacy. So the first thing that I want to bring to the table is that there's an impression that survivors are a monolith. That when we do something in the criminal justice system, we're doing it on behalf of the monolith of survivors. This is what majority of survivors want, etc. Like any group of people, what we have found when we actually look at the survivors of violence and talk to them and solicit their feedback is that we're all snowflakes. We all have a different experience with the violence that we encountered. We all have a different, a set of feelings of the people who committed the harm against us. We all have different resources and tools and hopes and ideas of justice and all of these other things. So I say that because I want to point out that the system itself perpetuates itself through this lie that all survivors want the same thing. And the perfect example of this is sort of brought down to its core when we look at the death penalty. So when somebody is executed, and unfortunately in the last year and a half, we have now started doing executions again in this country. When someone is executed, there is often a serious amount of press release that will come out that points out that the family wanted this. And there's this intense, like, this is finally justice. After 30 years, justice has been had, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have also seen, and probably most Americans don't see this because it's not clickbait, I have also seen the opposite, where somebody is about to be executed and the family with their attorney will go in front of the media and they'll say, do not kill this person on my behalf. And we conveniently ignore that. So you can't tell me that the system is built to be responsive to survivors, because it's only responsive to survivors when it fits the narrative that these individuals deserve to die. So you're not actually survivor-centered. You just happen to be using the tools as the survivors as tools. And that's what I tell people when I went through the court process and I testified. The way I present and how articulate I am was used as a tool to sway, right? To make it very clear that if a jury were to hear me, he would be found guilty. And there's a whole lot of biases in that. There's a whole lot of emotional, like, pulling at people's strings that I can do and all of that that's wrapped up in racism, classism, like all of this sort of stuff. Does that mean he's more or less guilty than the person who, doesn't have a witness who can testify against him as articulate as I can? And these ideas of justice as black and white, right? In restorative justice, we we have a lot of survivors who participate in restorative justice. And the number one thing that the research shows is that even though survivors are all different and we all are on our own journey of healing, the number one thing that all survivors want is closure. And everybody finds closure in their life in a different way.
Facts. 1,000% right. So in regards to the death penalty, you said that we actually started, we resumed executions in the past year and a half. I know there are a lot of states who've actually abolished the death penalty. Do you know the numbers on like which states or how many states still have that available?
Yeah, because I also like feel like I don't know, as a society, I feel like I never hear anything about the death penalty or the fact that it's an issue or how big of an issue it actually is until somebody's about to 3 days away from execution. And like fucking Kim Kardashian posted on her Instagram story. And now everybody's talking about this poor guy who has been innocent for the past 50 years. He went to jail when he was 19 and he's like 65. Like that is what I feel like is the narrative around it. And unless that's not happening, or like you're engulfed in the space full time, like it's just not, it doesn't seem like an issue that should have as much like spotlight as it, or has as much spotlight as it should, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's 27 states and the federal government who can execute. So we have.
Those mainly southern states?
No, you can, I'll share the map with you so you can see.
We can put the link to the map in the show notes.
Awesome. Great. I'll share it with you.
Great.
So the thing I want to say about that is that generally speaking, the death penalty has been losing popularity since the 70s. And the reason I'm a public speaker to end life imprisonment is because as the death penalty loses popularity, life without parole has skyrocketed.
Yeah. It's like the alternative. They think it's like, oh, well, at least you didn't die. Like you'll just stay in jail and just die in here when you're fucking 80 or whatever.
And there are some things that are worse than death. And for many people who are serving a life without parole sentence, they actually wished that they were sentenced to capital punishment as opposed to life without.
Wow.
So I know. So, okay, let's get into it now. I feel like we're going to get into the
let's get into it.
So
not the last 30 minutes.
No, because there's like, I can see people not being for the death penalty, but I feel like there's a good amount of people who are fine with life without parole, especially if you've had family members or if you or yourself were a victim. I know we just talked about victims and families and things like that, but what would you say to somebody who is for life without parole? And why do you think life without parole is not a good thing? Because there's definitely terrible people out there, and there's definitely people who I personally believe should be in prison. Like there's serial killers out there. There's child molesters, rapists who do the worst of the worst. Mm-hmm. And I can't imagine them just being in prison for 25 years and then just being released out into the public, especially if they're not quote unquote reformed. I know prison really isn't reforming as many people as it's supposed to be. It's not doing its job. But for the people who are, I guess, are like me, who think life without parole kind of is a necessity for certain people, what would you say to that?
Okay, before you answer,
very long-winded.
Can I before you answer and we get the real answer on this and the facts that I know you're about to drop on Jared so hard, can I just I just want you to tell me if I'm like going in the right direction with this. Even people who like that Jared are just describing are like the worst of the worst or whatever that get these sentences, like 99.9% of the time, a statistic I just made up right now.
You make up your own statistics?
Yes. Those people have like horrible, like traumatic histories of things that they experienced as children or adults or whatever the time period was before they went over to a life of crime or.
But does that make it right?
I'm not saying it makes it right, but I think, and Brashani's going to tell me if I'm correct, but I think like part of the argument of restorative justice is like these people have ended up at this point because of everything they've gone through never was resolved or whatever. So is it helpful to just let them rot in jail forever? Or is it more helpful, because we're all human beings at the end of the day, to provide them with, which for America to do this, it's like, feels so far off.
Yeah,
but
you
like,
got to think about who we're talking about now.
But provide them with the tools that they need to like handle their shit internally and mentally, which might be decades of shit built up, than to just like let them rot in jail. It just is like the easy way out, I guess. That's what I want to say about that.
And let me preface this, like, I agree with that sentiment. And Brashani, I kind of like, I'm half and half on the fence, but I don't think it's possible for every American, or for an American, to say there's not at least one person who you think should not have life without parole. Like one terrible serial killer, Ted Bundy. Let's use him as an example. You don't think he should have life without parole?
Oh God. Okay, let's just let her respond to your question.
Like some of these people.
Let's just let her respond to the question, because I feel like she's gonna have facts. Sorry,
she's 1,000% gonna have facts.
We are so far off the rails at this.
No, actually, no, you're not. And let me tell you why. You all just brought up about 10 points that are regular topics of discussion of why we're talking about life without parole now, and why we're talking about mass incarceration. So a couple of things just to name. People who are serving life without parole, and also virtual life sentences, which is the case of, like, let's say somebody gets sentenced to 160 years. That's a life without parole sentence. Like, let's just be real, right?
Yeah. I never understood why they do that.
It's statutes. So from a legal perspective, they just do it. They just add on like the minimum number of years that's required for a particular charge. And then they get to 160. Sometimes a judge is a real jerk and is like, I hate you, so I'm going to give you 400 years. Okay. Yeah. So it's an emotional response in a system that claims to not be emotional, by the way. So, okay. Don't want to get too far off track. So the idea that the people who are serving life without parole and virtual life sentences are the worst of the worst. And did I just freeze? There.
No, you're good.
Okay. I'm back. Okay. The idea that they're the worst of the worst is not true. We have 70,000 people serving life without parole or virtual life sentences in this country. So Jared, you bring up the conversation around Ted Bundy, the BTK killer. There are a number of notorious serial killers that what I call are the red herrings in this conversation. So serial killers, and I guess we would say like the worst of the worst, people who could never be reformed or rehabilitated, they represent about 0.0002% of the system. So we've built the system backwards. We've built it with a life without parole option that's like a giant net that captures all of the fish. And we say amongst these fish, there's got to be one of them that's poisonous. As opposed to building the system in the opposite way that says we take life without parole off the table, because Jared, to answer your question, I don't think life without parole should be a sentence for anybody. We take life without parole off the table, and your release is contingent upon a variety of benchmarks and assessments and parole hearings. In other words, you may never be guaranteed to be released, but we are going to allow you the opportunities after 20 years, 25 years, et cetera, to go before a parole board and make the case.
So you have some faith of getting out. You have something to be looking. So the inmate or the prisoner would have some faith of getting out, or something to be looking forward to. It would be some motivation to reform. Well,
when you take hope off the table, what have you just done? And, I don't know if you've shared with your audience or not, your family experience, so I don't want to like put that out there. But I think if you talk to the people who are inside the system and like ask them, how does an incarcerated person behave who has no hope? And you suddenly have a very dangerous environment. You have nothing to lose. You have nothing to work towards. And we're asking other human beings to work in that environment, right? So that's sort of like one prong of it. The other sort of stuff that Asia brought up is like, we got to ask ourselves, what is the goal of the prison system? Now, Jared, I noticed that you mentioned rehabilitation, right? And you're like, the prison isn't doing what it's meant to do. Actually, it depends on who you ask. Nobody is on the same page about what the purpose of the prison system is. there are three purposes that everybody like is on some sort of trajectory. Over on the right, you have everybody who's like pounding the public safety drum. They say these individuals are dangerous. We always have to keep them locked up, which, by the way, no research, you will not find any. There is no research that establishes incarceration beyond 20 years as effective for public safety. Then there's the people in the middle who say, I really want some rehabilitation. I'd like this person to be a different person so that if they do come home, they're not going to come home and like hurt all kinds of people. Okay, that's like that. I think that's a pretty like typical American response. And then you have the left, like very much like people like me who are like, this is inhumane. Not only is it ineffective and costly, but you've put people that we love and care about in a cage and you treat them like animals. And then you're surprised when you get an animalistic response. Mm-hmm. And we happen to know from the research that prisons are actually the largest nursing homes in our country because our population is so old at this point. The largest mental health institutions because
up to
sorry, continue.
Up to 90% of the incarcerated population meets ACEs criteria for trauma. And 70% and the largest quote unquote recovery or addiction places because it's estimated that 70% of the incarcerated population meet criteria for active substance use disorder. And if you think those places prevent them from using drugs and getting into drugs, no,
it doesn't.
Prisons are a microcosm of whatever happens out here. And human beings are going to do whatever they need to do to survive every single day. And let me tell you, if I was sentenced to life without parole, I would hang it up. And I'm being real. Because how do you wake up every single day with absolutely no hope to ever make a case that you're a different person from age 20 to age 50? It's like, think about when you were 20 years old, right? And who you are today. And again, I'm not saying this is like a get out of jail free card. And what I want to clearly establish is that there's no research that supports the effectiveness of incarceration. So Asia's question, last part of this I'll say, is what's the purpose in terms of survivors? Restorative justice says if we help incarcerated people understand their own trauma, then we literally make space in the brain for them to actually take accountability. But we operate in a system that doesn't reward accountability. Hence the stereotype of the incarcerated person who says that they're not guilty. There's nothing more damaging for a survivor than a person who 25 years later is still saying that they didn't do it.
Mm.
Right.
And to your point about 70,000, I think you said 70,000 people right now are in prison with life without the possibility of parole. I'm pretty sure there's a good amount of those individuals who are innocent.
So I'm going to avoid the innocence. I'm going to avoid the innocence trajectory because I think that those people, the people who are innocent, which let's be real, they are absolutely in there. Absolutely in there. I think that those individuals automatically get a lot of our compassion. And as soon as we find out that somebody is innocent, we're like, get them the hell out of there. Like we don't put them in a cage. I'm the advocate who is for the person who did it.
Yeah. That makes sense. I have two questions. My first question is, well, just to play devil's advocate, I don't believe this, like, I don't support this belief, but I feel like I've heard people say, like, if they have the option of parole and they go before the parole board and they are like serial killers or whatever their situation is, considered to be dangerous to the public, I'm doing air quotes, couldn't they just get up in front of the parole board and like put on an act to get out of prison, just to get out, whatever? These are just things I've heard people say. Like, what would you respond to somebody who said something like that? Like, can't they just like trick their, or like
put on an act to say,
like
I'm
act their way
or,
out of it. Yeah.
I would simply go back to the fact that we're then continuing to operate a system based on this statistical anomaly. Because if we're, again, going back to serial killers or people like who are putting on the act who are, quote, still dangerous. So the research shows that people age out of crime. So Asia, I think you mentioned earlier, like turn to a life of crime or, something like that. That's another myth, right? So the age, the length of the average career criminal, and I'm doing air quotes for career criminal, is 10 years. So like that's the same length of time of my side hustle for working for Comic-Con. So I don't take that as like my, the definition of my life or whatever, engaged in sort of like criminal activity, quote unquote. So before the parole board, I just want to point out our parole boards don't release people. So we have like an average statistical release of like 30%. And that's not for people who committed homicide, by the way. That's like other charges and stuff like that. When you look at homicide, it's even rarer. So if we take the statistical anomaly of the serial killer and we put them in front of the statistical anomaly of the parole board, now we're literally talking about keeping a system intact for this idea that we can somehow prevent murder. And I want to point out we can't, because if I take all of the people who have already committed murder and I put them in prison, there's no research that supports that that's deterring in any way. So the next murder that happens tomorrow, which I promise you it will, it's going to happen because that's what human beings do. And it has nothing to do
especially
with
Americans,
especially Americans with guns. And so me filling up the prisons and threatening and saying, look at all this life without parole and capital punishment. And if you do this too, the problem with deterrence is that, number one, you're thinking that the person is going to be aware of the punishment for their crime. Considering that 50% of the people who commit homicide get away with it, there's actually a good chance that they're going to get away with it. And also you're committing the homicide at like age 20 or 21. So were you aware of the laws in your state when you were 20 or 21?
Hell
Probably
no.
not.
Wait a second. 50% of people who commit homicide get away with it?
Yo, you didn't know this? They don't be solving anything.
Yo, those are some pretty good odds.
So then the second prong of deterrence, right? You're aware of the punishment. And then the second prong is that you are rational mind enough to stop and say, hey, if I do this thing, I might end up with life without parole.
No. Anybody
who's about to commit murder is not thinking clearly. They're not thinking.
Okay, so answer this, because I think this is important. And I think this is important. And this is what I'm thinking right now, too. What can you give us an example of maybe a country that is doing this the correct way? Or like if you had,
that's gonna be my question. If
you had your way, if you tomorrow, Brashani, could change the entire prison system, what would you do? Or what is working? Like what's the evidence? Tell me where it's working. I know there are countries who are doing it better than us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what are they doing?
But also, before you start, are these countries that you're going to bring up? Because I mean, we've had this conversation in the past. Are they even comparable to us as in our violence? Because America is just such a violent place. Is it really comparable at the end of the day?
So there are things that are comparable, and then there are things that aren't. So culturally speaking, we have way more guns. I mean, like that's just a fact, right? And when people get worried about, I'm going to be controversial when I say this, when people worry about their kids getting killed in schools, school shootings and things like that, school shootings, I think on the list of locations of where kids are going to die by gun, it's like 12th or something. It's like, the first place that a child is going to die from gun violence is in the home.
In the home.
Right,
yep.
right.
Yeah. And so yes, Jared, you are correct that one of the reasons that it's hard to just take from what other countries are doing and apply it is because America is unique. But I want to point out that the thing that actually makes it impossible to just take those systems and apply them here is an attitude. And our American attitude is that you did the crime, you do the time. You ended up here because you deserved it. And there is very much a punitive, punishing attitude, like non-forgiving and all of that, which I would like to point out, by the way, is based in a white supremacist colonial mindset. It came here from England.
I was just going to say, like, similar to other things such as racism, this stuff is so deeply ingrained in who we are as a country. One would have the attitude of like, can we ever fix this? Which is sometimes how we feel about racism. Like, are we ever going to get to where we want to be? And then it's like the hopeless thing. But anyways, go ahead with what you were saying about the whatever other countries are doing.
So the things that can be applied are that we would no longer incarcerate anybody who is no longer dangerous. I'm not lying to you when I say I know right now an 80-year-old man who is blind and dying in a bed in a hospital, like in a prison right now, right? And that other incarcerated men take care of him as he's dying.
Let him out.
There's a whole swath, like we're literally talking like nursing homes filled, right? They're in prisons, and prisons are not built to be hospitals.
Yeah, the conditions are terrible.
Mm-hmm. And there are large groups of people, the perception again is that these individuals are dangerous, but there are large groups of people who are not, even if they have committed homicide in the past. In fact, the safest group of people to let out from a research perspective is anybody who committed homicide when they were young and are now over the age of 45. Because they've done 20 to 25 years and they know what the toll is of violence, because committing homicide, and this is a hard thing for Americans to like wrap their mind around, actually traumatizes the individual as well.
Oh, for sure.
Think about it, right? If you killed somebody, that haunts you
forever.
Forever, right? It can't be undone. And there's large groups of people that we would automatically release from the prisons, because what we need to do is reduce the population down to like who are actually the core needs, right? Then we need to get the people who need substance use disorder treatment, mental health treatment. And we need to do the reentry, reintegration process in conjunction with the families and the community. And it needs to start the day that people enter the system. Then there's the structural part. Prisons are built for number one priority is quote unquote safety. And in the name of safety, we have caged individuals. Germany, Sweden, Norway. These places actually allow incarcerated people to have the keys to their own cells, and they leave every day and go to work. And then they return home that night, and then they're home for the time, whatever their sentence is. And they basically start the reintegration process. So as opposed to taking, in most cases, a man who may be the breadwinner of the family or like another stabilizing part of the family and putting him in prison and making him a financial burden, we have now said, like, these are the boundaries of behavior that you need to like follow. We're giving you a job. We're going to give you some education, some training. We're going to let you spend time with your family. Here are the rules. When you don't follow the rules, you get these privileges taken away. But all of that is focused on rehabilitation with an eye that most people can change.
Yeah, I was going to say,
having the key.
They don't even give people jobs who went to jail for weed for 2 years. Like, they're like, I kind of started laughing when you said go to work and then come back to jail. Like, imagine in America.
Yo, imagine them having their own keys to their cell. I cannot imagine that in the United States.
So here's the thing.
Nuts.
But here's the thing. Like, the human spirit is incredibly resilient, and we underestimate people often. And we often assume the worst of the worst instead of allowing them to show us what they're capable of. And when you talk to people inside, my dissertation was on resilience among adult men who committed homicide as juveniles. And I talked to them about like what was the light bulb moment, yo? Like, when was the moment that you woke up and realized, like, I need to do something different? And the number one thing was relationships. And the second thing was education. When they had somebody who believed in them, and this is very much like a traumatized child, right? When they have someone who believes in them, whether it's a correctional officer, somebody who works in the administration, another incarcerated person who basically says, like, listen, like, you're smart and you can do this. I believe in you. Like, let's try to do something different, and essentially mentors them and guides them. Like, those are game changers.
Yeah. And speaking on when you talked about reintegration, I know just taking a person from society and locking them inside, not allowing them to see the outside world, and then just throwing them back out there once they're released, that's also so traumatizing to the inmate and the person. They don't know how, once they're back into society, what it is now. If you've been gone and removed from that place for 20 to 40 years, you're coming into a whole new world. So can you touch a little bit more on, I guess, what they can do inside the prison, or I guess what policies can be made for reintegration?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think the number one thing is that reentry needs to begin day one, no matter what somebody's sentence is. The question needs to be asked, how do we help you change, and how do we reintegrate you back into your community? There are a number of laws that make it so that when people come home, so we take somebody out of the community and we put them in prison. We say, you're dangerous. Inside the prison, they then form their own communities, because that's what human beings do. When somebody is released from prison, most people don't know, you're not allowed to communicate with those individuals ever again. You can be reincarcerated for fraternizing with another felon. I'm using air quotes in that language, right?
Or gang members, or anybody who they see as criminal.
Right. So you then put them back into the community, like you said, 20 or 30 years later, and now they're alone. Mm-hmm. And whatever their sentence was actually equates a life sentence, because they can't get certain jobs. They can't live in certain places. There's a stigma that will forever follow them. So in terms of policies, we need to make it so that family and friends and loved ones have access to their incarcerated loved ones all the time, which includes like funding, phone calls, and things of that nature. For anyone who doesn't know, Securus, which is one of 3 phone companies in this country that operates inside the prisons, it's like an $80 billion industry on the backs of the most marginalized populations. I
mean, you call a prison, they ask you if you're going to accept these charges or not.
Well, so you have to fund it. So like you pay it. So like if I want to talk to somebody inside, I go and put $20 on their PIN or whatever. And then like they can call me and it's like $2 or $3 a call or whatever. For somebody who's like, it's, to stay in communication with the men and women I work inside, it costs me about $100 a week.
Oh, wow.
So I'm able to actually like use that, right? I have privilege that I can actually do that to do my activism work. But think about a family that's struggling and working 2 jobs and trying to stay in contact with their loved one. So we need to remove the financial barriers of communication. We need to release the people who are no longer dangerous. And we need to do reentry we need to focus more on funding reentry and less on funding prison.
So are there any like types of legislation or laws that anybody listening to right now should be focused on if they're interested in activism or prison reform?
And or organizations, like I'm the average person listening to this for the first time and my mind is blown. And like, where do I even start if I want to support this movement?
I'm going to give you a couple of links. A couple of the big ones are the Sentencing Project, which is a research-based advocacy group out of DC. And then another one that I refer people to is the Equal Justice Initiative. Same thing. These are nonpartisan groups, right? So they're not politically motivated. They're trying to make it really clear that incarceration is not effective. It doesn't meet any of the needs of public safety. It doesn't meet the needs of survivors. It's cruel and inhumane, et cetera, et cetera. I refer people to those 2 organizations because from there, you're going to find all of the other organizations that will sort of draw and catch your eye. In terms of legislation, there's a lot of criminal justice reform happening in every state right now. It's really a great time. Actually, our pendulum is sort of swinging in the right direction finally. And the big movements are to decarcerate, right? So to say, like, if you're older than 65 years old, we're going to let you come home. If you've done 30 years, we're going to let you go before a parole board. If you were sentenced under the age of 25 and you've done 20 years, we're going to go back and look at your sentence and see whether or not you deserve a life without parole sentence, like those types of, things. Felony murder, actually, I didn't mention this, but felony murder is a really hot topic right now because for listeners who may not know, you can be sentenced to life without parole for felony murder, which means you were present when the murder happened, but you weren't the person who actually committed the murder.
Yeah. If you're like the driver of a getaway car, or if you were just there. Yeah.
Yes.
I think like for the 3 people on this call, this is an obvious statement, but for others, it might not be. So I want to lift it up because I think it just is a huge part of the conversation. The population of people who are in prison are obviously predominantly Black people or people of color. And so can you just touch on a little bit about, it's obvious to us, but I think like how that as a fact affects like how much people care about this or don't care about this, or how much our government cares about this or doesn't care about this, and like how real that actually is for this issue.
I mean, it's so real. If it was what I thought was the effective argument to get people to change their minds, I would lead with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm being honest about it, right? Like I think in America, there's a real resistance to like looking at the racist structures that are embedded in our culture. So people of color and poor people, which are typically people of color, are disproportionately incarcerated. And Jared, I remember when I gave my presentation, you were deeply moved when I shared that for a white man, your chances of being incarcerated over the course of your lifetime are 1 in 17, like any type of incarceration. For a Hispanic man, it's 1 in 8. And for a Black man, it's 1 in 3.
Sick.
Yeah. And I remember that. And my whole life, like I'm 30 now, I take pride. I don't want to say I take pride in it.
No,
but I know, like
you should.
Me and my close friends, like we take pride in never having been locked up, never having been put in handcuffs or any type of situation like that. Because I mean, we can easily be a statistic. We easily be one of those 3 people, 1 in 3 people that have been in prison or have been to jail, have been locked up, have been arrested, anything like that. So there's times when I just run and think like, wow, like, and I'm trying to stay away from that as much as possible. You know what I mean? And it obviously is up to us to stay away, but I feel like sometimes it could be taken out of our control.
Well, no, I think like what's important to emphasize is like you should feel pride about that, because you would think like you wouldn't have to go out of your way to do that. Like you could just be a citizen and not have to have that risk, but that's not the case. So like, yes, Black men specifically do have to go out of their way and go above and beyond to make sure you're not in that position. And just due to the circumstances that a lot of Black people and Black men are in, it is sometimes very challenging to do that. And I feel like that is why, like, just to explain to people listening, like that's why there is a sense of pride, because it's hard to do. Like the system in the country and the structures make that hard for people to do. And there are so many Black men who cannot say that they've never been arrested or never been, sent to jail, not because they were doing the wrong thing, but just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So
speak on it.
It's just like, you should not feel bad or like feel a type of way of like saying that you're proud of that, because it's hard to do. And which we know by the fact that Brashani just said 1 in 3 Black, like the chances is 33%. That's just for being Black. You have a 33% chance. Like that's crazy.
Right. And so when we look at every aspect of the criminal justice system, there are racial inequalities everywhere. So if you are a Black man on trial, your chances of getting a life sentence are much greater. If the victims were white and female, oh my God, the death penalty is so on the table. Right?
Yeah, 100%, you're done.
It's so there's when we look at the sentencing aspect, who's actually arrested, what kind of time you do, like there are racial.
Who the judge is.
I mean, racial inequities across the board, who gets bail, like who gets actually paroled. I mean, like these are all things that for whatever reason, the American public resist this sort of conversation because I think, to be quite honest, I don't think our country is reconciled with the guilt and shame that we have of our history, that this country was built on the blood and violence of slavery. I mean, like, that's sort of where I'm at. So when I talk about these reforms and I'm in certain spaces, I very much bring up like that this has a race and class issue, like loaded, you know? And then when I'm sort of talking with like the average person, I really stay focused on the fact that prison is ineffective, it's costly, it's inhumane. And, you know, to get Americans to care about it, what I'll say is 50%, it is now estimated that 50% of adults in America have a loved one who has experienced incarceration. So the reason, it's not by chance that we are having this conversation and mass incarceration is now on the table, is because I have always said since I was a kid, if you had a loved one who was in prison and you went and saw the conditions in which they were living, no matter what they had done, you would call your politician and you would, pardon my language, you would fucking demand that something about that system be different, because it is, I mean, it is cruel and inhumane and inhospitable and traumatizing and violent and dangerous and all of the things.
I also think until you've had a loved one, like you're saying, you don't even have to visit them to feel that way. Like, I think like I definitely have, and I'm sure Jared has had loved ones who have spent time in prison or jail, and despite knowing like whether they were innocent or guilty, or whether they deserved their sentence or didn't deserve their sentence, despite knowing all the facts, like that's still your whoever, like that's still the cousin you grew up with when you were 5, or like you know what I mean? And so
yeah,
as a loved one, it can be very like, number one, a mind fuck, because you're like, especially when the person did something stupid and you're like, why would you, come on. But like, that still doesn't justify like what they're going through in there. And then when you actually, even if you never visited them, like when you see them come home and see how different they are and how like maybe they end up in the same cycles just because they have no direction or whatever it is, like whatever they did becomes like, I understand they did this, but they went and they served their time, and like we're still all feeling the effects of like what they experienced when they were in there. And it's just a wild thing to go through as a loved one or a family member who had somebody experience the prison system. And it like I just say that to say you don't even have to see them in there to see the effects of it or to feel the effects of it. Sure. And I think that's why, like, yeah, it's hard for people who haven't had that experience to agree or
understand
relate.
this.
Yeah, or understand. So
I've had very close family members locked up in prison. My mom was a CO for 25 years. She retired as a corrections officer. I have close friends who were corrections officers, but they left because they just didn't like seeing, quote unquote, their people in that type of situation, just the atmosphere of prison. Then I still have friends who are still correction officers. So I've seen every side of prison. I know that's why I feel so strongly on this topic. And I was very excited to have Brashani on to speak on it, because I know she feels passionately about it as well. One of my final questions for you, Brashani, is for all your experience in this fight and in this journey, have you ever ran into anybody on, I don't want to make it political, but like as a Republican or maybe far right, who also had the same beliefs as you? Or is it mostly people who are, I guess, Democratic and to the left?
That's a good question, because I feel like a lot of people in this country are just, we talk about this a lot, Jared, but just blindly following their party.
True.
So,
but yeah. I mean, there's plenty of people on the right who have family members and who have experienced prison and things like that. So I'm curious to see if you ever come across any people who have been like-minded like you, but just different politically.
Yeah, we need a little hope here.
The answer is yes. And let me tell you something that most people don't think about when they think about politics. There's a difference between what the politician actually believes is right and what the politician does because they want to get reelected.
Yeah.
Facts.
Sick.
Facts. You might have to say that again.
I have sat in many a legislative session with a person who identifies as a very far right Republican, somebody, right? And they have looked at me straight in the face and they have said, life without parole doesn't make sense and it's inhumane and everybody should have a chance to come home. I will never get reelected if I support this legislation.
That's just terrible.
Yeah, but like, all right, fine. You won't get reelected. So go on your fucking campaign and lie about what you actually believe. But then when you get in there and once you are reelected, like, then what's your excuse? Like, you've gotten reelected. You now have the power that you so desired. And like, you're still not, I mean, I understand it's not as simple as I'm making it sound, because when you're fighting for those policy changes, you have to go through whatever hoops to make actual change. So I get it, but like, that shit's annoying. Sorry.
Well, let's take a prime example, right? Governor Baker, I call him the milquetoast conservative. Like, he just doesn't do anything. Like, everybody likes him, quote unquote. And the reason they do is because he does not take a stance on anything. Like, he stays very in the middle, whatever. Well, guess what? For the first time in 3 decades, a governor of Massachusetts commuted 2 life without parole sentences last week.
Sick.
Guess why Governor Baker felt like he could do that? Because he's not running for re-election.
Well, there just should be no re-election. Abolish re-election.
I mean, I look at it like there are certain things, and other countries do this, by the way. There are certain things that should be policy driven that are based on the research, and therefore it's not attached to people's elections or campaigns.
Right.
So if we have a task force in the legislation that is focused on reforming what we call common sense criminal justice reforms, that's a committee of people who look at what the research shows us, and then they make legislation that is based on the research, and their job is not attached to a popularity contest. So just food for thought, right? I know I could talk to you all for the rest of the day. So I appreciate the time and the space, and Jareed, like, always bring your authentic feelings about it, right? Because the only way we're going to get through this is as human beings come to the table and recognize we're all trying to do the best that we can. And we all have positive intent, and we all have the same goals in mind. And so then it just becomes a question of like, how do we do the most effective and humane and like just thing?
Yeah. What would you, besides what you just said, because that was great, is there anything else like that you would want to leave people with before you go, like some final statements or just food for thought, before we wrap up? Because to your point, we could be here all day.
And drop your socials.
Yeah.
If you would like to.
Yeah, no, please. Yeah. Okay. So I'm Dr. Brashani Reece. If you Google me, you can find me pretty easily. You'll find me on Instagram and Facebook. I'm the co-founder of the DropLWOP New England Project. LWOP stands for Life Without Parole. So hit me up on socials, drop me an email. You want to get involved? You have further questions? Please reach out to me. I love to be that person. And then final thought always is, I lead with my heart. I ask other people to be open to leading with your heart and seeing where that takes us.
Mic drop. I love that so much.
This was so good. Wow. Now I'm going to think about this for the rest of the day and probably spiraling into documentaries about prison reform. But yeah, no, this was amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. You are welcome back literally anytime.
Yeah, I think the listeners are going to love you. And I think we also need to touch your brain, because you're so well informed on capitalism and everything that's going on right now with capitalism and the economy, because I know you're also passionate about that as well. So
I know you could come on about 75 different topics. We could do domestic violence. Yeah, we could do something about domestic violence. Anyways,
we could.
Please come back and see us. If you guys liked this episode, share it with somebody, send it to somebody, leave a review, leave a rating, all that good stuff.
Yes, make sure you follow us on the socials. Done WTH Adulting on Twitter. Done with Adulting Pod on Instagram. Dr. Brashani Reece, again, we thank you so much for all your knowledge.
Thank you.